Forget Jack Sparrow. Forget the romance of tall ships and fair winds. Today we delve into the life of a man whose existence was not merely a story, but an anatomy of obsession. A man who was simultaneously a gentleman and a monster, an explorer and a predator. His name was Thomas Cavendish. Picture this: an aristocrat, a Cambridge graduate, heir to an ancient lineage. His destiny, it seemed, was predetermined. A quiet estate, an honorable service, a dignified death in his own bed. But Thomas Cavendish, our dear gentleman pirate, decided otherwise. He didn't just step outside the lines. He tore them to shreds, transforming from a polished gentleman into a ruthless privateer whose name struck terror into Spanish galleons. This man embarked on a daring circumnavigation, the second in English history after Drake, filled his holds with enough gold to buy a kingdom, and then vanished. Simply disappeared. Into oblivion, into nothingness. Like a ghost, haunted by his own demons, not by glory. His story is more than a chronicle of a culture of ambition and despair. Cavendish embodies the paradox of the Elizabethan era, where hero and cutthroat were often synonymous, and state interests elegantly masked simple piracy. He was simultaneously a national asset, plundering Spanish colonies for the crown, and a merciless killer who didn't shy away from torture for profit. He didn't just sail the seas. He sailed on a razor's edge, blurring all lines between noble explorer and bloodthirsty predator. His legacy isn't just new maps and tons of silver. It's a question. What makes a man like this? What transformed this aristocrat into a sea-wolf? What abyss opened beneath the feet of a Cambridge graduate, forcing him to trade his ancestral home for the creak of ship planks and the smell of gunpowder? This is a story not only about gold, but also about how worlds collapse when money runs out, and the thirst for greatness has only just begun. We're accustomed to seeing him as a myth, a polished image, the gentleman pirate, a national hero, the scourge of Spanish galleons, second only to Drake. But let's cast aside that gilded veneer, that heroic camouflage, and peer into the abyss from which the true nature of this hero emerged. Thomas Cavendish. Not some port ruffian, not an unprincipled upstart from the slums. No. This was a hereditary nobleman, a man whose ancestors had owned lands for centuries, whose blood mingled with that of the English aristocracy. A Cambridge graduate, he was endowed not only with privilege, but also with a sharp mind, an education that opened doors to any office, any salon. Imagine, golden youth, brilliant prospects, a family estate, a lineage that could adorn half of London like captured banners. It seemed fate itself had issued him a pass to high society, where champagne flowed freely and intrigues unfolded in velvet boudoir, where the words honor and dignity still held some meaning. On the surface, he was the ideal gentleman, but beneath that flawless, polished facade lay not just a crack, but a deep, festering chasm. And that crack, as is often the case in such stories, turned out to be financial. Collapse. Not just not enough for a new carriage, not a simple budget cut. This was a true, systemic, devastating blow, crashing down on him like an executioner's hammer. The curtain fell, revealing not a stage but an abyss. The illusion of stability, of centuries-old certainty, crumbled in an instant. Suddenly, Lord Thomas Cavendish, descendant of a glorious line, found himself on the brink of absolute ruin, all-consuming shame, complete oblivion. What does a person do when the world they knew, the world in which they were someone, crumbles to dust beneath their feet? Some break under the weight of such a blow, becoming shadows of themselves. Some seek solace in wine, in opium, in oblivion. And some, in a moment of desperation, find within themselves that very abyss that whispers, either you devour this world, or it will devour you. This was not merely a financial collapse. It was an existential crisis that exposed something primal, something predatory within him. And it was here, against the backdrop of Cavendish's personal apocalypse, that Her Majesty Elizabeth III entered the scene, the Virgin Queen, whose reign was an era not only of great discoveries, but also of the greatest, most unvarnished cynicism. This was a time when the crown didn't just turn a blind eye to piracy, it sanctioned it. It made it state policy, an instrument of geopolitical pressure, a way to replenish the treasury, disregarding all moral norms. The line between a privateer, whose right to plunder was confirmed by a royal patent hanging on the wall next to his family crest, and a cutthroat, who slit throats for a bag of coins, was not merely blurred. It was so indistinct that only the devil himself could distinguish one from the other, and even he would likely nod approvingly. This was an era when ambition, despair, and an insatiable thirst for gold intertwined into a tight, bloody knot, which could only be cut with a blade. Or, far more effectively, with a cannonball to the hull of a treasure-laden galleon. In this world, where law was merely a tool for the powerful, and morality the lot of the weak, Cavendish found his new religion. For Cavendish, this knot untangled the moment he made the most radical decision of his life. To sell. To sell his ancestral estate, down to the last brick, to the last acre of land that had belonged to his forefathers for centuries. This was not merely an act of desperation, not just a forced measure. It was a ritual sacrifice, a symbolic burning of everything that connected him to the past, to his former identity. Burning bridges behind which there was nothing but an irrevocable past, nothing but the ruins of his former life. He wasn't just seeking money, he was seeking revenge. The desire for untold riches was, of course, a powerful motivator, but it was merely the tip of the iceberg of his madness. Beneath it lay a deeper, darker, more twisted obsession, the pursuit of fame, of recognition that would eclipse the disgrace of his downfall. A challenge. A challenge to the society that had turned its back on him when his family gold ran out. A challenge to his own fate, which seemed to have condemned him to insignificance. He wanted to prove to himself that he wasn't broken, to prove to the world that he was not just Thomas Cavendish, a ruined aristocrat, but something more, something indomitable. He wanted to become a legend, or a monster. And in that era, these concepts were often not just synonyms, but one and the same, simply called differently depending on who held the pen or the sword. And this hunger, this insatiable need for greatness, for proving his existence through blood and gold, led him to the ships, to the boundless, cruel expanses of the ocean, where the laws of men did not apply, only the laws of steel, gunpowder, and ruthless survival. There, on those waters, he didn't just seek treasures, he created his own cruel empire. Step by step, from one bloody episode to another, from one captured city to the next, richer, more doomed. So we left Thomas Cavendish, the aristocrat turned shark, on the threshold of his greatest adventure, driven not by a thirst for discovery, but by a far more earthly and burning passion: revenge, glory, and of course gold. He sold his ancestral home, gambled everything he had, and set sail on a voyage that would either elevate him to the top of the world or bury him at its bottom. And soon he faced the first true test that revealed his true nature. Not just a brave navigator, but a cold, calculating predator. The route to the Pacific Ocean for any captain of that era was tantamount to a leap into the abyss. The Strait of Magellan was not merely a narrow arm of water. It was a purgatory where headwinds could hold ships for weeks, where storms struck without warning, and the cold pierced to the bone. For Cavendish, it was not just a geographical challenge but a psychological game of survival, a test of endurance for him and his crew. Entering this labyrinth of rocks and fog in early 1587, he encountered a nightmare that surpassed all expectations. His ships, the Desire, the Content, and the Hue, struggled through an icy hell, where every gust of wind threatened to smash them against impenetrable shores. Days turned into weeks, provisions dwindled, and despair mounted. But Cavendish did not waver. His strategic mind, honed in academic debates and gambling, worked flawlessly. He used every lull in the storm, every faint favorable wind, to push forward, never allowing the crew to doubt his resolve for a second. He was the embodiment of an indomitable spirit, but a spirit devoid of any sentimentality. And then, in the midst of this hellish passage, when hope seemed to have died, they stumbled upon what was to become Port Famine, Puerto del Hambre. This was the Spanish colony of Ciudad del Rey Don Felipe, founded several years earlier to protect the strait. But instead of a flourishing settlement, Cavendish found only ruins and living ghosts. Of the 400 Spanish colonists, only 23 emaciated, starving people remained alive. Their eyes were full of supplication, their bodies shriveled shadows. What would an ordinary person do? perhaps offer help, share their meager supplies. But Cavendish was not an ordinary person. He was a predator, and these unfortunates were not victims to him, but a resource. He coldly listened to their stories of hunger, disease, and madness, absorbing every detail about local conditions, Spanish routes, and defensive weaknesses. He offered them an illusion of choice. Of course, he couldn't take everyone aboard his ships. That would have been suicide. But he could have, for example, left them some food, water, weapons. Instead, he took one of them, a certain Tomé, a Spaniard who volunteered to be his guide. He exploited the desperation of these people, their last ounces of strength, to extract all useful information from them, and then left them to die, renaming their settlement Port Famine, a grim reminder of the fate of those who stood in the way of his ambitions. This was the first warning bell, the first chord in the symphony of his ruthlessness. Breaking free from the icy embrace of the Strait of Magellan and leaving the dying Spaniards behind, Cavendish burst into the Pacific Ocean like a predator released from its cage. And here, in the boundless expanses, he unleashed his destructive nature. The Pacific coast of the Spanish colonies became an inexhaustible source of plunder for him. His raids were not merely robbery, but a scorched earth tactic, designed not only to enrich him, but also to inflict maximum damage on the Spanish crown. Whenever a Spanish city appeared on the horizon, Cavendish acted with cold, surgical precision. Take Paita, for example, a prosperous port on the coast of Peru. His ships appeared suddenly, like ghosts from the fog. The landing was swift, no long sieges, no negotiations. The goal was not territorial conquest, but maximum extraction of valuables in minimum time. His crew, consisting of hardened sea wolves trained by him, acted like a well-oiled machine. They stormed warehouses, churches, and homes, taking gold, silver, pearls, precious fabrics, provisions, everything that could be carried away. And then the second phase began: destruction. Ships in the harbor were burned to deprive the Spanish of the ability to pursue him. Warehouses were set ablaze to strip them of resources. City buildings were reduced to ashes. Dead men tell no tales. That was the unspoken principle by which Cavendish operated. He left no witnesses, no resources, nothing that could aid in recovery or resistance. This was not merely revenge. It was a display of force, an act of terror designed to paralyze the will of the Spanish colonists. After Paita came Guayaquil, Arica, Pisco. Each city became a backdrop for his bloody spectacle. Each raid a new stroke to the portrait of a merciless privateer. He reveled in this power, this control over others' lives and destinies, seeing it as confirmation of his superiority. The culmination, the apotheosis of his first circumnavigation, came on November 4th, 1587, off the coast of California. It was there, as if by fate's design, that the legendary Manila galleon, Santa Ana, appeared on the horizon. This was no mere ship. It was a floating castle, annually transporting untold treasures from Manila to Acapulco. Gold, silk, spices, porcelain, all the riches of the East. This was the prize all pirates and privateers dreamed of, and Cavendish was ready for it. He pursued it for several days, like a hungry wolf tracking its prey. When the Santa Ana was finally caught, Cavendish did not hesitate. His flagship, the Desire, and the smaller Content attacked the giant. The battle that followed lasted 5 hours, an exhausting, brutal struggle where each side fought for its life and its future. The Spanish galleon was poorly armed for naval combat, but its enormous size and thick hull made it almost invulnerable to Cavendish's cannons. Cannonballs bounced off the hull like peas. But Cavendish was not only brave, but also inventive. He ordered the use of chain shot, which tore the Santa Ana's sails and rigging, immobilizing it. Then incendiary shells came into play, turning the galleon's deck into hell. Smoke and screams mingled with the roar of cannons. The Spanish captain, Alonso de Gonzalez, fought to the last, displaying valor worthy of a better fate. But the odds were unequal. Finally, after 5 hours of continuous fire and boarding attempts, the Santa Ana was forced to strike its flag. What the English discovered on board surpassed all their wildest dreams. The holds were crammed with gold. 122,000 pesos of gold, which by modern standards amounts to tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. Thousands of bales of silk, hundreds of tons of spices, precious stones, porcelain. This was plunder that could make every crew member immensely wealthy. But the pinnacle of Cavendish's power was marred by his own ruthlessness. Spanish prisoners, including women and children, were gathered on deck. What to do with them? To leave them alive meant risking them revealing his location. To take them along was a burden. Cavendish, without hesitation, marooned 190 prisoners, including women and children, on a deserted shore, giving them only a little water and bread, condemning them to certain death by starvation and thirst. Several dozen, younger and stronger, were kept aboard as slaves. This was not an act of madness, but a cold, calculated act of pragmatism, devoid of any humanity. And then followed another decision that shocked even some members of his crew. The Santa Ana was too large, too slow to be a prize. She would be a burden. And Cavendish ordered her burned. Before the eyes of the prisoners left on shore and his own crew, who had not yet fully grasped the magnitude of what had happened, the invaluable galleon, a symbol of Spanish power and wealth, turned into a blazing hulk. This was not just the destruction of a ship, it was a message of his indomitable will, of his readiness to do anything for his goal. At this peak of power, as Cavendish reveled in authority and wealth, the first cracks in his crew were already appearing. Discontent grew. The cruelty he displayed was not always understood by everyone, even the most hardened privateers. His decisions, sometimes bordering on madness, raised questions. But who could oppose him? He was at the top. He was Thomas Cavendish, the gentleman pirate, obsessed with gold and glory. But behind this ostentatious power lay other forces, other players, whose interests were closely intertwined with his bloody adventures. And of course, there were those who desperately tried to stop this insane march of death and riches. We've seen how an aristocrat, whose name was once synonymous with ruin, transformed into a predator obsessed with gold. We've watched him carve up other people's destinies, leaving behind blazing shipwrecks and shattered souls. But let's not be naive. Do you truly believe that all this madness was merely the whim of one bankrupt gentleman, albeit one with a brilliant Cambridge education? Well, then you don't understand the true nature of power, the true nature of royal power. Behind every shadow cast by the burning galleon, Santa Ana, stood other shadows, far more powerful ones. Queen Elizabeth I, her court, full of schemers, spies, and calculating financiers. They didn't just sanction piracy, they sponsored it. This wasn't privateering, it was state racketeering, wrapped in a thin veil of legality. If you think Cavendish, by selling his ancestral estate, risked everything, you're mistaken. He was merely the tip of the spear held by the crown itself. Imagine Elizabethan England. Young, ambitious, but constantly in need of money and resources, surrounded by the mighty Spanish Empire. What does a clever but cynical monarch do? She doesn't just declare war, she creates a system where private investments merge with state interests in a perfect symbiosis of legalized plunder. The companions, as these investors were called, were not just Cavendish's friends. They were London merchants, members of the Privy Council, and sometimes even the royal court itself. They invested huge sums in these risky but potentially fabulously profitable ventures. Every ship, every cannon shot, every bag of gold stolen from Spain was the result of this devilish public-private partnership. Who benefited from Cavendish's bloody adventures? Of course, he himself, basking in fame and wealth, though not for long. But the lion's share of the booty went to the top. Into Elizabeth's treasury, which used this money to fund wars, strengthen the fleet, and maintain the luxury of the court. Into the pockets of influential lords, such as Francis Walsingham, who not only oversaw the spy network, but was also one of the most active patrons of privateers. This was not just a pirate expedition. It was a meticulously planned economic sabotage aimed at undermining the Spanish monopoly in the New World. Each captured galleon, each burned colony, was a blow not only to Spanish finances, but also to their imperial prestige. But let's not forget that this story had another side, a side that desperately tried to stop this lawlessness. Not just the Spanish fleet, which, despite all its power, was too cumbersome and slow to effectively counter the fast and daring English raiders. No, we're talking about the entire colossal, yet surprisingly fragile, Spanish defense system. From forts on the Pacific coast to scattered garrisons in the Andes. They were like a giant, yet slow-reacting organism trying to defend itself against a venomous snake. Their fatal miscalculations were obvious. The Spanish were accustomed to monopoly, to the absence of serious opponents in the Pacific. Their ships were heavy, their intelligence slow. But that doesn't mean they didn't resist. On the contrary. Behind every defeat were heroic, but futile, attempts to stop Cavendish's insane machine. Recall the captain of the galleon. Santa Anna. The valiant Alonso de Gonzalez. He didn't just surrender. He fought for 5 hours, using every available means, trying to protect the crown's treasures and the lives of his passengers. This was not just a ship. It was a symbol of Spanish pride that Cavendish turned into a blazing torch. Yes, Gonzalez was doomed. His ship was too slow, his crew too few to withstand Cavendish's ruthless efficiency, using chain and incendiary shot. But his resistance was an act of desperation, a testament that even in the face of imminent doom, the Spanish Empire would not surrender without a fight. There were others, governors who tried to organize pursuit, local militias who vainly tried to defend their cities, lonely patrols who clashed with English raiders and died doing their duty. This was not just a hunt for gold. It was a war where on one side stood ruthless efficiency, and on the other, the pride and resistance of the doomed. And while Cavendish reveled in his victory, unaware that his own crew was already beginning to doubt his sanity, these scattered acts of resistance formed an invisible, yet powerful wave. A wave that sooner or later was bound to engulf him too. For even if you conquer the world, something will always conquer you. And so, there he was, Thomas Cavendish, the gentleman pirate, returned from his first circumnavigation, cloaked in glory and gold, showered with royal favor. He was on top of the world, but for men like him, the summit is merely a springboard for a new, even more dizzying leap, or a fall. In his mind, a new, even more ambitious plan was already brewing, a second circumnavigation that would definitively cement his status as the greatest navigator and privateer of his era. He believed he could repeat the triumph, that fortune was his eternal companion. What a naive delusion. Cavendish's second voyage, which began in 1591, was not merely a failure. It was an epic catastrophe, a slow, agonizing demise that exposed the utter fragility of human arrogance in the face of ruthless elements and his own ambition-ridden spirit. History, my friends, rarely repeats itself exactly, and if you expect it to always treat you kindly, it will likely club you over the head. From the very beginning, everything went wrong. Instead of fair winds, storms; instead of clear skies, impenetrable gloom. Unpredictable, brutal weather conditions battered his fleet, scattering ships like splinters. The Strait of Magellan, which he had once conquered, now became an icy hell, unwilling to release its victims. Ships were battered, supplies dwindled, but far more terrifying was the fading hope and strength of the crews. And then it came, the constant companion of long voyages: disease. Scurvy, fever, dysentery. They mowed down sailors faster than Spanish bullets. Decks turned into infirmaries. The air permeated with the smell of decay and despair. But if physical suffering was terrible, the psychological breakdown proved even more devastating. Cavendish, accustomed to unquestioning obedience and adoration, faced growing discontent and then open mutiny. His once unyielding authority, bolstered by gold and victories, crumbled under the weight of defeats. The crew, seeing him not as a hero, but as a madman leading them to certain death, began to fall apart. Individual ships deserted, abandoning their captain to his fate. Those who remained were prisoners of despair rather than loyal comrades. And in this chaos, in this agony, Cavendish made one fatal mistake after another. His decisions became increasingly irrational, dictated not by logic, but by mounting despair and paranoia. He lost not only ships and men, but also his sanity, transforming from a daring leader into a broken, embittered man. He blamed everyone but himself for his fiasco. He was obsessed with the ghosts of past triumph, not noticing how the present was consuming him. The circumstances of his death at sea remain vague, shrouded in conjecture. But one thing is certain. It was not a heroic death in battle. No glorious end, no last breath exhaled on the crest of a wave amidst the roar of cannons. No. Most likely, Thomas Cavendish slowly faded away. From debilitating illness, from hunger, from physical exhaustion, but far more terrifyingly, from a deep, all-consuming despondency. He died not as a warrior, but as a broken man, realizing the complete, bleak collapse of all his ambitions, all those grandiose plans that had once driven him forward. His last thoughts. What did he see as the darkness closed in? The gold of the Santa Ana that never brought him lasting happiness? The faces of those Spaniards he condemned to starve? Or perhaps only emptiness, the realization that his entire life, built on the pursuit of glory and wealth, was merely a vain chase after a mirage that dissolved in the salty waters of the Atlantic? He, a man who so craved to be etched in history in golden letters, vanished into oblivion despite his past triumphs. His glory, like his ships, shattered on the reefs of monstrous failure. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest irony of his fate. But the story of Thomas Cavendish is not just the tragedy of one man. It is a mirror reflecting something far deeper and more unsettling. Something that concerns not only pirates and kings, but all of us. And so we arrive at the most unsettling lesson Thomas Cavendish